China doesn't want to go to war with the United States. It wants win-win relations. The US has benefited tremendously from relations with China, certainly in the trade dimension. The problem with is that while China benefited from the trade, trade is always a win-win relationship if there's no coercion involved, because essentially parties seek to trade equivalence, right? So the reason why I trade with you is because I'm thinking I'm getting something which is equivalent to what I'm trading with you. So
Mhm.
trade is always about equivalence absent coercion. Well, China benefited and it took its benefits and it turned the country into a moderately prosperous nation. It
Mhm.
built commonwealth for everybody. And in the United States, the US benefited tremendously, but instead of taking that wealth and turning it into commonwealth, it turned it into private wealth. And it was just the ruling imperial elite that made out like bandits, even as the country, especially the industrial core, was being gutted out and people were deeply impoverished and immiserated. Now, having done that, they're going to leverage that immiseration and suffering and turn that into animosity against China. Always blame the other for what
Mhm.
you have done, just as we see the Trump administration blaming immigrants for, essentially decades of neoliberal, violence, structural violence against the working class.
Mhm.
So this is the same formula, create the problem, appropriate the wealth and the benefits, and then blame the other. The analogy is, there is you have a big, you sit down with, the businessman sits down at the table with the worker and an immigrant,
Mhm.
and the businessman eats 9 slices of the pizza pie, and then says to the worker, "Watch out for that immigrant. They want to take your slice."
Exactly.
Great metaphor there. What
Okay.
about the U.S. economy, in which, if there's a significant crisis that in that respect, in terms of liquidity or uh, their credit card getting maxed out, how would that impact what they do?
Well, the U.S. economy has been heading for the toilet for a long time now. It's really been a 3-decade process, really a 5-decade process.
Yeah.
And that 5-decade process is one of neoliberalism, which is another way of saying that it's had deindustrialization of the economy. It's a shift towards financialization.
Yeah.
It's a shift towards monopoly capital. So capitalism, if you have quote unquote an unfettered free market, what happens is that eventually corporations become monopolies in their fields, in their sectors. Anybody who's played the game of monopoly understands this.
All
You
right.
essentially you get monopolies. And when you have monopolies, monopolies do a couple of things. One of them is they take over the entire market and then they inshitify everything. They reduce their products and services. Everything becomes really, 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 really crappy, right? Because they have the monopoly and all they need to do is gouge. You have nowhere else to go to. So that's one phenomenon. The other thing that they do is because you're gouging and immiserating the working classes, people no longer can even buy the products that this monopoly corporation is selling or providing. And therefore, the monopoly corporation and monopoly capitalism in general shifts towards financialization. That is, it just claims rents. It just claims, it uses its monopoly power to create financial leverage in order to just gouge money out of people.
Mhm.
And that money is almost always, kind of a claim on future earnings. So, for example, if you can't buy a car, GM will offer you a loan. In fact, at a certain point, GM's finance department was larger than the manufacturing department, right? If you go on to DoorDash and you cannot buy that burrito because it's so overpriced, you can pay it in 4 easy payments. I mean, that's literally the case right now. People are taking out payments to pay for, their burrito. Same thing with Apple, can't afford your newest Apple because Apple has this built-in obsolescence and therefore you can't afford it. Well, they'll put you on a payment plan. And
Hmm.
all this are claims on your future earnings, but essentially it's the process of financialization. The US has moved towards financialization as monopoly capital would have it do. And because of that, it's hollowed out its real capacities. And if you go up against a country like Russia or China, which has real manufacturing industrial capacity, it's that conclusion is quite clear. If you think just in the domain of war, and modern war is industrial war, then a financial power is not going to be able to prevail against an industrial power, especially the kind of intense attritive industrial war that we're seeing, for example, in Ukraine. So, and then the other piece is that the US thought that it holds the levers of power because it controls the global financial system. That is to say, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Now, that too doesn't work out because the US has over abused its capacity as the reserve currency. It's been sanctioning one third of the population of the world because of its currencies based on its control of the dollar. And so countries are de-dollarizing and they're creating alternate financial structures. And they don't need to rely on the dollar, certainly not as much as before. Their reserves, the dollar as money as a, as a form of saving has been reduced. You see them starting to ditch US treasuries. We're not seeing the petrodollar and the dollar recycling as we
Hmm.
did before. So treasuries are in trouble. And then you also see that they're diversifying into other currencies, their national currencies, and simply doing swaps. And so that's the money function as a unit of credit and as a unit of account. So they're using the money and they're using their equivalent currencies as ways of trading with each other. So the power of the dollar is diminishing. And so essentially what the US has done over these decades, but most certainly over the past decade, and certainly when it started to weaponize the dollar against Russia, is it has been sawing off the branch on which the US hegemony relies on, that it's, this exorbitant privilege of being the reserve currency, this seigniorage, it has been undermining its capacity. So all of this is to say is that the US economy is heading in a very, very bad direction, as capitalist economies always do. Capitalist economies always transition towards monopoly and financialization, and then imperialism. That's how we get imperialism. And of course, from a political standpoint, then we also see fascism because, fascism is simply capitalism in decay.